Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. So as Jasper mentioned, I will talk about pre-registration and registered reports today. My talk will consist of 4 parts. So first, I'll introduce what pre-registration is and what registered reports are, so that everyone is on the same page. Then I'll talk about the why. Why are people pre-register their studies? Why should people consider that? Why are people writing registered reports rather than regular articles? In the third part, we'll talk about how. So give some practical tips on how you could pre-register your studies if you want to. And then in the final section, I will address some frequently asked questions regarding pre-registration and registered reports. However, feel free, as Jasper said, to ask me questions in the chat. After each section, I will briefly pause to see whether there are any questions. And yeah, we'll hopefully you will enjoy this talk and learn something from it. So I assume that most of you here are psychologists or studying to be psychologists or a related area. So if that is the case, then most of you are probably familiar with the form of this picture. So in probably one of the first classes in Introduction to Methodology or Introduction to Statistics, you may have seen something called the empirical cycle. Now, it's typically the flow that researchers follow in order to, do research. But typically it starts from some kind of observation, some old knowledge, some data you're looking at, some observation in real life. And from that, you try to induce a theory, you try to induce a hypothesis from which you deduce a particular prediction that you then go on to test on some kind of data. And afterwards, you evaluate whether the hypothesis or theory is being supported or not. Now, typically, or the idea behind pre-registration rather, is that just before you move from basically the prediction stage or the deduction stage to the testing stage, you pause for a second and you say, well, at this point, I basically take a snapshot of what my prediction is, of what kind of study I want to do, what kind of data I want to collect, and how I will analyze or process that data in order to answer my research question. So that's the idea behind pre-registration. So pre-registration involves giving a description about the hypothesis or hypotheses that you want to test, the study's design, procedure, materials you might use, and an analysis plan. What kind of variables are you measuring? How are you going to process data? What kind of statistical models you might fit? Things of that nature. And the idea is that this pre-registration is ideally sufficiently specific and precise. It should occur either before the data is being collected or at least before the data is being analyzed. So before you can get, let's say, influenced by the actual data after looking at the data. And finally, the idea is that pre-registration should be public, either immediately, so when you decide to pre-register, or down the road after some time, after giving yourself some time to perform the analyses and maybe write a report about it. Now, registered reports are a specific form of pre-registration, you could say. So typically the idea or a normal research cycle looks as follows. So first you develop an idea, you design a study to investigate that idea, You collect and analyze some data, you write a report about it, and then you seek to publish that report in a scientific journal. So that is the typical workflow, if you will. Now, registered reports are a specific article type that is currently being accepted by 288 different scientific journals. And the idea is that, in contrast to regular reports where you get peer review all the way at the end, you get 2 stages of peer review. So the idea is that you first develop a study, design a study, come up with an analysis plan. And at that point, you submit that proposal to a journal. And the journal will evaluate that proposal based on suitability within the scope of that journal, and it will send it out for peer review to 2 or 3 experts in that field. And these experts evaluate your study based on its merits. Is that a good design to answer that particular research question? Is that a good way to analyze this particular data that you will collect? So importantly, it's before you actually collect any data that you submit that proposal to a journal. And if you receive the green light by a journal, then that journal commits to publishing your article regardless of the outcome of a study. So suppose you're interested in examining whether a certain treatment has an effect on depression. And typically in the normal or traditional way of evaluating publications, you will get evaluated based on whether the outcome of your study is interesting, is significant. So if your proposed treatment works, that's great, that's often publishable. If it doesn't work, often your chances are not as high of getting published, which might lead to a publication bias that only successful studies will get published, whereas so-called null results will not get published. This is different in registered reports. So if you get the green light at stage 1, the journal commits to publishing your study regardless of the actual outcome of your study, as long as you keep to your original pre-registered plan. If you all of a sudden decide to completely change the way you're going to collect data, then they might object to that. But as long as you stick to the original plan and write a discussion in an interesting way that correctly describes and links the obtained findings to the field, then you will get published, or then the report will get published either way. So that is, in short, what pre-registration is about and what registered reports are about. Are there any questions about that so far?
So far, I didn't see anything in the chat, Tom.
Okay.
You can give people a couple of seconds.
Yeah. But there is, of course, I will address some frequently asked questions at some point also during the talk, so it might be that you may have some questions that will be addressed later in this talk. But if there is like really something that I said that is unclear, then this would be a good opportunity to ask for feedback or clarification.
It was very clear, apparently.
Okay, that doesn't appear to be the case. Good. Then I will move on to the why part. So why would that be relevant to pre-register? Why do we need these registered reports? Now, pre-registration is certainly not a new idea. It's been around for decades. However, it has received new interest within psychology in the last decade because of a number of interesting things that happened, let's say around 2001, 2011, 2012. And the first event that I listed here was a publication by Daryl Bem titled Feeling the Future. And that particular paper was or claimed that people are able to predict the future. So there were 7 or 8 maybe different studies, experimental studies, that allegedly showed that people are able to predict the future. And this was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is one of the most impactful journals in that field. And so, for instance, in one of the studies, Daryl Bem asked participants to take part in an experiment in which people had to guess behind which of the 2 curtains an erotic image would appear. So they were sat behind a computer, they saw 2 pictures of a curtain, and behind one of the pictures would an erotic image appear later on. And the task of subjects was to predict behind which of the curtains that would happen. And apparently, according to this paper, people are able to predict that above chance. And this study was remarkable for 2 reasons. One is the obvious one. Well, that seems really far-fetched, that idea. I mean, it goes against basic laws of physics that people would be able to predict the future. And so it was remarkable for that reason. It was also remarkable because it wasn't remarkable in the sense that it didn't do anything special. It analyzed data as any other study analyzed data. There wasn't any evidence of fraud. It was just, apart from the weird topic and the weird conclusion, it was just like any other study. And that sort of raised a lot of alarm bells in many scientists at the time. Because in this particular case, we know, or let's say 99% of scientists would agree that, okay, the null hypothesis is true here. We know there is no such thing as precognition that would violate basically everything we know about physics. So in this case, we know the null hypothesis is actually true. But in all these other studies where the effect is much more believable, we don't know that. But these studies do the same thing. So how often are we actually rejecting the null hypothesis incorrectly? In other words, how high is our false error rate truly? And this next study by Simmons and colleagues sort of builds on that idea, and it's provocatively titled False Positive Psychology, Undisclosed Flexibility in Data Collection and Analysis Allows Presenting Anything as Significant. The idea is this. So typically, if you collect some data, there are different ways to go from the raw data to the eventual conclusion of a study. So for instance, you might have several dependent variables, and you might pick one of them. There are different ways of transforming variables. Maybe you have outliers. There are different ways of excluding outliers, of excluding data points in general. And you can always find a motivation for each and any one of them. But if you pick an option based on the eventual outcome, in other words, if you pick an option in order to get a significant result, for example, then your alpha level, that is usually 0.05, your false positive rate that we typically accept within psychology, is actually much higher than that. And that is what Simmons et al. Showed. Basically, if you want, as long as you're patient enough, you will always be able to present something as significant. And then finally, the final nail in the coffin, if you will, is the paper by John and colleagues, which showed that researchers are indeed engaging in what they call this kind of questionable research practices. So in selectively picking the dependent variable that shows the most interesting or most desirable results, sequential testing. So if after 20 participants you don't have a significant effect, let's add 5 more until we get a significant effect, things of that nature, which of course inflate that false positive rate, sometimes without even realizing it. Or without researchers realizing it. And so this all led to a call within psychological science to do research in a more rigorous manner. And rather than deciding how you're going to analyze your data after observing the data, with pre-registration, you fix that in advance. So you don't have the option to flexibly pick, okay, which dependent variable I'm going to analyze, which outlier criterion am I going to use, what is my sample size going to be. You don't have the flexibility anymore to choose the most desirable pathway, let's say. So with pre-registration, you fix that in advance before looking at the data or before collecting the data. And now, of course, the question is, well, sounds good, in theory does good, but does it work? Does pre-registration indeed fix this issue of an inflated false positive rate? And there are some studies that indeed point in that direction. The first one that I'm going to mention is one from Kaplan and Irving, who looked at clinical trials. Now, in this research area, pre-registration was much more established, or much earlier established, namely from year 2000 onwards, studies needed to register the primary outcomes. And according to this study, studies that were conducted before this date had a much higher chance of obtaining a beneficial effect of a certain treatment or a certain intervention, compared to studies that were being conducted after this year 2000, where it was mandatory to register the primary outcomes of the study. So what this could suggest is that before 2000, researchers had the option to flexibly pick the outcome that produced the most publishable, the most desirable result, so an intervention showing effect. Whereas after 2000, this was no longer possible. And so the alpha level, the type 1 error rate, or false positive rate, was much closer to the typical 1.05. So we see much fewer studies showing a beneficial effect. Of course, you're not sure, it's not we can't causally attribute that to pre-registration, but it does point in that direction. Here is another piece of evidence that points in a similar direction. It's a study by Wiseman and colleagues. And I think it's particularly interesting. It goes back to the Bem et al. Study in a way. So actually there is a field within psychology, or maybe not typically psychology, but it's called parapsychology. And that deals with things like telekinesis, things like precognition, so predicting the future. And even before the term registered reports was being coined in psychology in the last couple of years, they had a similar format since 1976 already, because they realized, well, this field is very contentious, so we need to be very rigorous when we do our research. So they had two kinds of article types: regular articles and registered reports, even though it wasn't called registered reports at the time. And if you look at the outcome of the studies, as I think most of us would agree, the null hypothesis of no effect would be true here. There is no such thing as predicting the future. There is no such thing as telekinesis. So we would expect 55% false positives. And indeed, if we look at the percentage of statistical tests that are statistically significant, we see that in the registered reports, this percentage is 8.4, which is much lower compared to the regular article type, where it's 28.4%. So in the latter, people had the opportunity to select a certain dependent variable, to remove certain participants who may not have shown telekinesis or not be able to tell the future, things of that nature. Whereas in the registered reports type, it was fixed in advance how the data would get analyzed. And there we also see a rate of significant tests that's much closer to the typical 5%. Now we get evidence from psychology, much more recent evidence. So registered reports are now around for, I would say, around 5 years, depending on the journal. So we now have a couple of registered reports that are already being published. So we can compare how they do in terms of number of significant effects. And in this study by Scheel and colleagues, they examined how many papers supported the first hypothesis that was being mentioned in a particular paper. And it seems that for standard reports, that nearly 100%, so nearly all studies in this particular sample showed or indicated that there was a significant effect. Whereas for registered reports, this was around 45%, so much lower. And again, this might suggest that it's because researchers have not as much flexibility in picking their analysis pathway and sort of getting the most desirable results, so to speak. And then finally, I want to mention a study, very recent study by Soderberg and my colleagues, which looks again at registered reports versus non-registered reports in psychology and neuroscience. And they asked people, researchers, to evaluate these papers based on a number of criteria. And that includes methodological rigor, quality of methods, analysis rigor, overall quality of the paper, etc. And nearly all of these outcomes indicated that the registered reports are of a much higher quality compared to the non-registered reports. Importantly, the people who provided these ratings were blind to the fact that a particular paper was a registered report or not. So they had no idea of telling, they could only look at the paper itself, and they estimated that registered reports were, or they viewed registered reports as much more rigorous on a number of dimensions. So taken together, it does seem that pre-registration and registered reports seem to reach their goal, seem to provide more or a higher quality, more unbiased studies. So that's good for science, but you may wonder, okay, what's in it for me personally as a researcher? And so there are also a number of more selfish reasons why pre-registration would be considered useful. First is that it can be considered to provide a shield against cognitive biases. So I'm guessing most of you are familiar with the term confirmation bias. So people in general tend to look for confirmation of their beliefs. So if they are confronted with evidence that supports what they believe in, they tend to accept that uncritically. Whereas if they're confronted with evidence that disconfirms what they believe in, they will look to reject that. And the same goes for researchers. Researchers are human, so they tend to look for confirmation for their hypotheses, tend to look for confirmation for their theories. And pre-registration kind of provides a shield against that. So you cannot get tricked in a way by the data. So you're sort of, because you decide in advance how you're going to approach the data, you are not going to get tempted by the outcome of a result. And of course, hindsight is 2020. So if you see, suppose you collected data for 3 dependent variables, you see that one of them supports your claim that particular treatment has a positive effect on depression, the other 2 outcomes do not. And you might find reasons why these other 2 outcomes do not provide evidence for your preferred treatment. Maybe they weren't reliable, whereas the other one, the one that does provide the effect, yeah, that's obviously the best one. But if you hadn't seen the data, maybe you would make a different judgment. You would consider all 3 dependent variables equally of equal quality. Another aspect with regard to pre-registration is that you need to think ahead. You need to be more organized because you need to plan ahead. So in my capacity as statistical consultant, I often get asked researchers to have a look at their data and how they can answer their research question with that data. And unfortunately, it happens regularly that I have to say, well, with this data or with this study that you did, you can't really answer your research question. You forgot to include control condition. You didn't include a manipulation check. Your sample size is not high enough, so your statistical power is just very low. Things of that nature. And with pre-registration, basically you need to think about these aspects beforehand. You need to think about, okay, do I include a control condition, yes or no? Basically, you need to ask your statistical advisor or methodological advisor, what is the best way to approach this? So you avoid hitting a dead end. So you are more organized by having to pre-register your studies. Also, it gives you some peace of mind, especially with regard to registered reports. So basically you did all the work, you thought everything through, and then it's just a matter of collecting data and following the path that you outlined. You know that whatever the results will be, it will get published in the case of a registered report. So that way it offers you some peace of mind. You can also add credibility to your claims. So if you obtained a finding that at first glance seems very surprising, if you can show a pre-registration and can show, well, I followed my plan that I outlined beforehand, then you can add credibility to that particular claim. And finally, it can also be considered an asset for certain jobs. So, for instance, this is an excerpt from a position as a postdoc at UGent, which reads, prior open science experience like data or code sharing, study pre-registration is highly desirable. And on this website here, you can also find a number of academic job offers that mention open science. So it might also be beneficial from that point of view. And finally, some journals may also ask in the submission portal whether a particular study has been pre-registered. So when you submit a study or a paper to a journal, you often get asked lots of questions. And one of these questions for some journals is, okay, was this study being pre-registered or not? And that's why it's important to know what pre-registration is. Even if you decide against pre-registration, that's fine, but at least you know that these questions might get asked and you can provide an intelligent answer to those questions rather than, well, I did not know that pre-registration was a possibility, or I don't know what that means. And also some journals now have a badge system to reward or signal pre-registration. So if you see this, this badge next to an article, then you know, okay, this study was pre-registered. So these are some of the reasons, first, why pre-registration is a hot topic within psychology, and then why you might consider doing it yourself, how it can be a benefit for yourself. I don't know whether there are any questions.
Not so far.
So far? Okay. Then I'll suggest I will move on to the how part. Maybe there will be questions afterwards. You can also send me an email if you want, if you don't want to speak up now. So let's go to the how part. So if you say, well, pre-registration, that looks like something for me, but how do I get started? So basically there are two main ways to go about this. The first one is to answer a list of questions. So these questions may vary in level of detail. Sometimes they're tailored to certain types of studies. So if you're doing a clinical trial or you're doing a replication study, it might be a specific template for these kind of studies. And one of them you can find on aspredicted.org, which is a website uniquely focused on pre-registration. And so it has basically a questionnaire of nine questions in total. On this slide, I have only added 4. And it's like, what's the main question being asked or hypothesis being tested in this study? Describe the key dependent variables, specifying how they will be measured, how many and which conditions will participants be assigned to, specify exactly which analyses you will conduct to examine the main question/hypothesis, things of that nature. And then the idea is that you answer these questions ideally as precisely as possible. The Open Science Framework, OSF.io, there are also a number of these templates which contain questions about your design, about your study, that you can use to guide your pre-registration. Now, the Open Science Framework is for more than just pre-registration. So it's different from the aspredicted.org website, which is specifically geared towards pre-registration. The OSF.io website is more general, so it allows you to share data, to share materials, share code, collaborate with colleagues, just as a sort of backup for yourself without wanting to share anything. And you also have the option to pre-register your work, to pre-register your project, your OSF project. And then you can choose from a number of templates on the OSF, which basically are similar to the one that I showed you earlier, which involves responding to a number of questions about your study, your analysis plan, etc. So that is one way to go about this. So answering a list of questions. The other way, or another way, is more similar to the registered report format in a sense that you write up your hypothesis, your design and analysis plan beforehand. And it's more of a verbal description, maybe inspired by a questionnaire or a checklist to make sure that you didn't miss anything. And so it's more of an open-ended pre-registration, which is also a possibility on the Open Science Framework, by the way, not on the aspredicted.org. Importantly, you can also include analysis codes in your pre-registration. And I want to show you an example of that here. So this is it's called R Markdown. Some of you may have heard of this or may have heard about R. So R is basically software typically used to analyze data or process data. It's, let's say, comparable to SPSS, except that it's not point and click, but it's just syntax-based analysis software. And our Markdown basically allows you to integrate your R code into your story. So here on this screenshot, and I'm not sure where you can see it clearly, but the first part is R code. It is sort of marked or shaded in gray. And the second part is text. And so the idea is that you write your paper here, write your text here, and insert input from R, so from your analysis at specific points in your text. So here I want to get the output of my t-test. Here I want to get the output of my ANOVA. Here I want to get the total number of participants, etc. And if you run this, you get something that looks like this. So just a text, exact same text that I showed you earlier, but with the numbers that you asked at specific locations. Now, our Markdown is, I think, a useful tool in general. So regardless of pre-registration, I think our Markdown is very useful to facilitate analytic reproducibility. But it might be particularly useful also within pre-registration in the sense that you can specify beforehand what your analysis code will do. So before collecting the data, so what you see now is after the data came in, but this particular code was actually used in a registered report by me and a number of colleagues. So basically what we did was we wrote our introduction, our method section, and actually our results section, but without having the numbers yet, without having the data yet. So we wrote what kind of analysis we were planning to do, including the code. And we submit that to a journal, went through to peer review after we got the green light, which took some time, to be fair. But after we got the green light, basically all we had to do was collect the data and then just press the run button. And then we got our paper. Sorry, our paper, of course, we did have to write, sorry, the discussion section. But that's also one possible way to do a pre-registration. So, okay, pre-registration is one thing, but a good pre-registration is another thing. So a good pre-registration is ideally specific, is ideally complete. And I mean, you can provide an answer to, for instance, the questions that I showed you earlier in different ways. You can just be relatively vague about it and still leave you a lot of freedom to play around with your data, but that's not a great pre-registration as such. The idea of a pre-registration is really that it guides you or guides you in a specific direction, and it should ideally be completely clear what kind of analysis you will run, and another pair of eyes on it will come up with the exact same analysis pathway based on your description. Of course, if you provided the code, that's in the second example, then it's completely unambiguous, and it's just, okay, yes, this is what's being done, and that's pre-registered, and that's easy to follow. So ideally, a good pre-registration is specific and complete. Of course, there may, after you run your study, you may come across a situation that you didn't predict in advance. So ideally, you try to avoid deviations as much as possible, especially within a registered report context, because your proposal was already reviewed and was approved. If you then try to or make changes to that, then there is a chance that reviewers will say, well, you made changes and that was not agreed upon. This is not okay. But at the same time, I want to stress that it's important to not be too rigid about this. If it makes sense to deviate from your pre-registration or your registered report proposal, and do it. For instance, again, the registered report that I just showed you the code for mentioned a particular outlier criterion or participant exclusion criterion rather in the original version. However, after running the study, we noticed that this would essentially lead us to exclude 25% of the participants or something like that, which is quite a high number. So we decided to deviate from our pre-registration and say, well, this outlier criteria doesn't make too much sense. To be fair, we didn't think it through. So it was a kind of a mistake, but I think it's fine. We're bound to make mistakes. The idea is, of course, to avoid that as much as possible, but still, it's unavoidable to miss some things. And then I think it's important to be transparent about it. So just mention that, and that's the key. So ideally, you share also your data. Well, in general, it's a good idea to share data if possible. So others can see, well, they didn't try to play around with this. They didn't try to do something fishy. It's really well motivated. And in our registered report, the editor and reviewers agreed that this was a sensible choice to deviate from our original plan. So transparency is key, I would say. So pre-registration is really like playing chess in a way. So you think about what kind of situations might arise and then how you deal with them. So what kind of moves can we expect and how do we respond to these moves? What will we do if a participant drops out? Remove the data, keep the data. And things of that nature are important to envision. And it's important to learn from colleagues. They might have experience with similar study. They know what to expect. You might develop some healthy lab habits, like this is in general how we deal with people dropping out. This is what we do if our assumptions for our statistical tests are violated, etc. So learn from each other. There are also lots of examples now out there that you can try or decide to use yourself. And finally, you could also consider running a pilot study or simulating data, which can help. In general, it's a good idea to run a pilot study, but also in the context of a pre-registration, then you know what to expect, or you know better what to expect. And you can, for instance, run, if you decide to use the approach with analysis code, you can run that analysis code on a pilot study, on simulated data, on data from a previous study. Okay, that brings me to the questions. Maybe there are questions.
5 questions after this part, but maybe you will handle them in the frequently asked questions. We don't know what's coming up. So what do you prefer, Tom? Should we go ahead with the presentation?
Maybe I'll just quickly run through the FAQs. Maybe there is some overlap with the actual questions, so it might make more sense.
Sure.
So one of the things that often comes up with pre-registration is, well, will people steal my ideas? Well, registrations do not have to be public from the start. So on the Open Science Framework, you can, of course, choose to make it public immediately, but you can also choose to embargo a registration. So you can say, well, this is my pre-registration. It will be registered on the Open Science Framework, but it will only become public after, let's say, a year, 2 years, 3 years, up to a maximum of 4 years. After 4 years, it will become public by default. So that gives you time to actually conduct your work, analyze data, publish a paper about this, and then when it's, for instance, accepted by a journal, you can make the registration public with the journal article. Of course, public pre-registrations may allow you to establish precedents, so you can show, well, I was the first one with that idea. So that could be an argument to make it public immediately, but I think psychology is not really a field where there is a lot of competition to be the first in something, I would say. Anyway, that might also be an argument in that case. Researchers can still cheat, right? So yeah, that's true. You can still commit fraud. You can still make up your data, but that's not the point of pre-registration. So the idea of pre-registration is that it increases transparency of the scientific workflow. It makes a clear distinction between what is predicted from the start and what was thought about afterwards, so after having access to the data. And that's the whole point of pre-registration, not to prevent fraud. And what about data-driven exploratory research? So as you may remember from the empirical cycle I showed you in the beginning, exploratory data-driven research is at a different point in the empirical cycle. So typically, pre-registration works best for hypothesis testing, so confirmatory research. But in principle, it is possible to still pre-register data-driven research. For instance, you can say, I split my data into two parts, a sort of training set and a test set. The test set is kept secret. The training set is where you do all your analysis on. You can do whatever you want, try out different dependent variables, different way of transformations, removing outliers, etc. If you're happy with your plan, you pre-register it. And then you look at the test set and analyze it according to your plan. Again, yes, you can cheat, but that's not the point of pre-registration. So pre-registration is not meant to discover cheating or whatever. It's meant to increase transparency, and yes, it's still possible to commit fraud, but I imagine that most researchers are not in the business of being fraudsters. But again, it might not always make sense for exploratory data-driven research. So think about whether pre-registration is really useful for the type of research you're doing. The idea is that it makes a distinction between exploration and hypothesis testing. And so one is not more valuable than another. They are both important components of your empirical cycle. If you remove one of them, your cycle sort of collapses. And to reinforce that idea, Cortex came in 2017 with exploratory reports. So it's an article type similar to registered reports, but then for exploratory research. And then finally, what are the downsides? So far it may have looked like sort of a promo talk for pre-registration and registered reports. So what are the downsides? Well, on one hand, it may seem like another administrative hurdle. You may need to get approval from the ethical committee. You may need to have a data management plan. And now I also have to make a pre-registration. That's true to a certain extent, but it's also a shifting workload. So certain things like doing the analysis, basically you do that before gathering data. So you think about the analysis before you actually collect the data rather than afterwards. And as I mentioned before, it can also save time in terms of avoiding dead ends, like, oh, well, your study didn't include a control condition. Yeah, can't really answer that question. If you thought about that beforehand, you wouldn't have collected all these data. So it can also be a benefit in that sense. And specific to registered reports, it may make up more time or take up more time on it because you have several review revision cycles compared to a regular article time. And that's a real concern, I think, especially for junior researchers who don't have that much time, especially towards maybe the end of the PhD. Do I still go for a registered report, yes or no? This is something to keep in mind, that you may have to go through several review revision cycles, one at stage 1, at stage 2. You might even get rejected somewhere at stage 1. And yeah, so that's a disadvantage. So recently, Chris Chambers, the one behind registered reports for the most part, came up with a solution to integrate registered reports in the peer community which basically is a platform to non-commercial, non-profit platform to provide reviews for preprints. So preprints are basically versions of an article before they are being published by a journal. So you peer review, or people commit to peer reviewing these articles before they published as a preprint. But importantly, within the context of registered reports, a number of journals have now accepted that if it passes this initial peer review by PCI, we will by default accept it in our journal. So this is a list of these journals. So if it passes peer review at the PCI, which is a general platform, which also commits to providing relatively structured, faster paced feedback, then it will automatically get accepted in these journals as long as it fits the scope, of course. And so I wanted to end with this quote by Jeff Rader. How many critics of pre-registration have tried it? I was a critic, we tried it. And by we, I mean Julia Haaf did it, and I watched. Whereas before I didn't see the value, now I do, at least for me in some circumstances. And I think that happens more often, that the PI, principal investigator, might be a bit skeptical that the junior academic, in this case Julia Haaf, proposes to do it, and that afterwards the PI might get convinced of its value. So that brings us to the end of my talk. I'm happy to
thank you very, very much.
Yeah.
That was really insightful, Tom. Thanks a lot. Daniel was the first one to write a question in the chat. I will read it out loud, and then if things were unclear, maybe Daniel can also switch on his microphone at some point. So his question is about pre-registration and working with already collected data and openly available data sets. What would be the best route for doing that? And are there good templates or good examples for doing that? He's currently reanalyzing data to test a specific hypothesis that is much different than the original one.
Yeah, I think that sort of goes back to, not entirely, but similar to this one. Yes, there are templates for that, I believe, on the Open Science framework. It's not entirely similar to this situation, but yes, it is possible to do that. Again, you have to think about, does it make sense? But it is possible to do that. And it's about transparency. If you say, well, I haven't looked at the data, that's important, not having looked at the data, and then say, okay, this is what I think I will do. Specify that in your pre-registration, and then look at the data. Yeah, I think that's it's possible to do that, and there are indeed templates on the OSF for this kind of research.
Yeah. All right. The second question is by Marine. She said, I have a question about withdrawing pre-registrations. Two times now I had to withdraw the pre-registration form from the OSF website because I wanted to edit an important detail like in exclusion criteria. This was before any data collection. The question is it okay to have withdrawn pre-registrations between brackets? And is there any other way to change the pre-registration before data collection? I think in any case, it might be good to pre-register right before data collection, when normally you don't tend to change the details anymore.
Yeah, I think there are two options there. One is indeed the withdrawal. And I think you can specify, or you can give a reason why you withdraw. So I think, again, transparency is key there. I would just specify the reason for withdrawing. Another option would be incremental registrations or pre-registrations. So you just add another pre-registration. I did that once before, where I said, well, in my case, actually, I already collected some data, and I realized something or I missed something, and then just, pre-register again, just explain what is different compared to the previous pre-registration. I think that makes also sense. So I think those are two options. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, it was clear for me, but if it's not clear for Marine, she can always write in the chat. Elke had a similar question about how to change pre-registration if you made a mistake on the OSF. So you already handled that. Then Merle says, do you have resources for learning how to use our Markdown for creating your manuscript and pre-registration?
Yeah. Yes, I can. Can I send that in some way? Like, is there a way to contact?
If you send it to the BAPS Junior board, we can distribute it to the people that were here. So
Yeah, okay.
It might be interesting for people that attended, for all people that attended this session.
Yeah.
Sounds good. And then Marbella has the final question. Can you use the same introduction and method section you wrote in your pre-registration for the research article you're planning to submit?
Yes. I would say ideally. I mean, I've done that once where I almost copied an entire part of my pre-registration there. Yes. I mean, the only, but even the only thing to keep in mind that some journals might be picky on is something already published somewhere. But I think especially if the pre-registration was not public yet, but would become public at the same time as the journal article, I think that won't be a problem. So I think that's one way, one example of what I mean with it's a shift in workload rather than an additional workload. So you think about it and you write about it, and often it's just a matter of changing your tenses in your method section. It's no longer a will, but is a was.
Right.
You reuse that.
Yeah. Thanks. Are there any more questions? You can still write them in the chat if you want.
Maybe just a quick question to follow up. So this wouldn't, because I also have the same thing for my own article that I'm writing right now. So copying the method that we've already pre-registered wouldn't count as plagiarism in the eye of the journals.
I would be very surprised because you wrote your pre-registration yourself. I mean, worst case, what I would do, but I think you would do that anyway, is refer to the pre-registration. So just provide a link to your pre-registration in the paper itself. But yeah, I would be very surprised if that would be considered plagiarism, and I haven't come across a case where that would be true. But yeah, if you include the citation, then you're safe anyway. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. Just wanted to check. Thank you.
Yeah.
And then another question in the chat that I read now. Hello, thanks for the presentation. If a study has been pre-registered with certain analyses that were not carried out in the end, or that after reflection no longer seem relevant, can these be ignored in the final article, or should they be mentioned?
I would say ideally you mention them. I think sort of similar to my example where I said, well, our initial outlier criterion or exclusion criterion was not well thought through, I would say. So we changed that, but we were explicit in the paper why we changed that. So it's transparent why you deviated from the original plan. If there are good reasons for that, especially, make sure that this is clear for your readers, for reviewers. I think it's better than, I mean, it might be embarrassed. I felt embarrassed as well about making that mistake, but I think it's worse to come across as maybe trying to hide something than making a silly mistake. And I think it's important that you shouldn't be ashamed of making mistakes, at the same time, it doesn't mean just do something, doesn't matter if it's still, of course, important to think about a good pre-registration before and think about all these possible scenarios. But if you miss something, I would say be transparent about that and just indicate this was a deviation and we deviated from that for that specific reason. I imagine there is a reason for that. So yeah, just mention it. I think it's fine.
Yeah, transparency is the key. I hear. Okay. If you still have questions, we will share Tom's email address. Is that okay for you, Tom?
Yeah.
People can still
It's not a
write you
secret.
longer questions afterwards. And for now, I think we can close off this session and people can have a break for 10 minutes because then we go back to the other Zoom line or link where there will be a session, a keynote talk on well-being. So that will also be very interesting. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending. And Tom, there's many people in the chat also sending their thanks to you. We'll chat so that you can read them afterwards.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.